Hello to all the comic fans, Marvel geeks, and all the nerds in between. Welcome to another episode of the new and improved Vigilante Vibes, where I give you all the Marvel discussions, theories, news, without the toxicity that's become such a big part in the fandom. I'm your host, Megan Nicole, and today I have a very special guest. You may have read his stories that include our favorite web-slinging hero, Spider-Man, or you may have seen him all over the internet spreading positivity. Please welcome TJ Miguel.
Hey guys, hope everybody's doing well today. Thanks for having me, Megan.
Thanks for coming on. I'm really excited. I can't believe we haven't done this for as long as we've known each other.
Right, yeah, it's crazy to think I've already been on the Facebook page for at least a couple of years and been sharing my stories for almost as long. So but yeah, I'm just grateful we're doing it now. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's exciting. So, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
All right, so the condensed version, I guess, in terms of, and this may not be as creative as I'm trying to make it sound, but I'm a dad, and so my sense of humor may not be everyone's cup of tea, but. No, I like to say you can get to know me pretty much by the two C's and the two S, or excuse me, had that wrong. Two F's and the two S's. Faith, first and foremost, is the first F. My Christian faith. That's pretty much what the most I consider the most important part of me. Followed immediately by my family. So I'm married with a couple young kids, and they are just the biggest blessings in the world. I absolutely just love every opportunity I get to spend with them. Um, and then the two S's, so sports, I grew up equal parts sporty guy and nerd. I'm not saying I was good at any sports in particular. Don't mistake that. But I grew up doing soccer, basketball, loved a lot of sports. But of course, the final S, as you may suspect, is Spider-Man. So, and it's funny too because aside from Spider-Man, I grew up mostly a DC guy until the MCU films really kind of came into the picture. Like I knew who Captain America and Iron Man and so on were from seeing them in like the '90s crossover cartoons and stuff, but I never really knew them until the MCU. Like I knew like Superman and Batman and the Justice League and all that. So, but now Spider-Man though it managed to always be my number one guy. So that's stayed true. In fact, I would say that's only increased since I've been a kid.
That's really cool. I didn't realize you were mostly a DC guy.
Yeah, yeah. I basically grew up watching the '90s Spider-Man series,
Mhm.
Spectacular Spider-Man, and then like all the DCAU stuff. I didn't watch a ton of like Earth's Mightiest Heroes and a lot of the Avengers stuff until much later on, and even I still haven't seen as much as I would like. It's as Cap would say, it's on the list. But I'll get to that some point down the road.
I will say maybe it's my bias, but I do hope someday we see some X-Men writing from you because that's my team.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, you never know. There's always the crossover potential. I mean, I have technically branched into a couple other things, but I don't know. We'll just have to see if something ever piques my interest.
Yeah. So, speaking of our main man, Spider-Man, what draws you to Spider-Man as a character and what aspects do you focus on in your writing?
Yeah. Well, I think in terms of what draws me to the character, I mean, I think to a degree, it's the level of importance of certain things has changed from when I first, watched Spider-Man 2 in the theater when I was 11 versus um, now being, 20 years later, as a kid versus an adult. I mean, as a kid, I just always loved the costume. I mean, all my sports team colors are red and blue, so I was drawn to, the cool costume. Um, and, I always appreciated from a power standpoint that he strode the line between being a Batman where, he technically doesn't have any true superpowers. Um, so he can do these incredible feats, but at the same time, he's not a Superman level in terms of like that, like nigh invincible, only the top tier could ever like challenge him in a physical sense. Like I always appreciated that balance because there was still a sense of danger to the character, while also still a bit of a power fantasy, which is definitely are both elements I try to incorporate in my writing. But I think that as I got older, I came to appreciate the story of the character and just, because as most, if not all of us already know, I mean, Peter was written to be the everyman, all the the Spider-Men and women and pigs and whatever have all been written to be similarly since then. Just look, it just looks a little different. But I mean, I connect to Spider-Man. I mean, even as I got older, like on a spiritual level, like I think of Spider-Man 2, one big thing that's a huge thing in that movie, from at least from my perspective, is Peter's at a point, kind of what Uncle Ben alluded to in the first movie, where he talked about, you know, these are the years when a man changes into the man he's going to become for the rest of his life. Like he was at the beginning of that in the first film, and he's still very much in the thick of it in two. And a large part of his arc is he has to decide, am I just really doing this for my uncle? Is this, or is this something that I can, am I going to hold on to this with great power, great responsibility, teaching, and is it going to like continue to control my life? And is it going to be something that I continue to live by? Like, can I keep this up? And excuse me, I think about that, like I alluded to, I grew up in a Christian home, and as I went away for college, for instance, I was in a similar position where I'm like, okay, I'm out on my own. I can make much more of my own choices now. It's like, am I going to, you know, still live by these same things that I was taught, by the people, the Uncle Bens in my life, the people close to me, the parents, the parental figures. So, and personally, I consider myself, I guess, to have arrived at a similar conclusion to where Peter does in that movie. So that's one reason among many that I always come back to that film as like the best Spider-Man film, Spider-Verse films included. Like as much as I love the breakthrough animation and I love the storytelling in those movies too, but that arc has just always resonated with me in particular. Just, the going from boy to man, making choices for yourself and not just in the service of, those who raised you. Um, so, but yeah, those are the big things. And so that only answers really half the question. So in terms of my, what I try to incorporate, I mean, we'll get into this more later, obviously, but I mean, there are so many great characteristics. I mean, Peter's sense of humor. I mean, he has always had a bit of a natural charisma, especially after he got his powers. Like his confidence level goes up. I think that's one thing the Spectacular Spider-Man does a good job of, is like Peter, even outside of the suit, is more confident. He doesn't flaunt it, obviously, in the same way that he does when he's in the suit, but I like that sense of confidence that he has, especially as he gets older. That his powers and his life experience give him. Um, and so the sense of humor and the just the love he has for those around him, especially his closest loved ones, which is also something else we'll get into. But like, I just love that he's at his core is someone who, he's a guy who loves what he does, but at the same time he's always fighting to go home and just make it through every day. He doesn't have a rich trust fund to just bank on, but he has real responsibilities that we all resonate with. So I just try to embody that as best as I can.
I like how you talked about what parts resonated with you the most with him, because that leads directly into my next question. Spider-Man is known for his relatability. How do you balance his superhero life with his personal struggles?
Yeah, and that's tricky. I mean, because and I think I've actually posted this quote on the Facebook page before on the Nerd Haven, but I really agree with the way Tom DeFalco put it, which is that suffering isn't Peter's predominant characteristic. It's responsibility. It's the back and forth, the tension of how much do his responsibilities as Spider-Man kind of are allowed to interfere with his responsibilities as Peter Parker and with his loved ones, with his career, whatever. And kind of the point that I've kind of come to in my head at least is that Peter Peter, as long as Peter is Spider-Man, he should never quite reach his full potential as himself, like in his everyday life. Like he could never be quite as good of a nephew or a scientist or a husband or whatever. Like it, but at the same time, that doesn't mean that, because it's easy to venture way too far down the other end. As we see everybody harps on the modern comics, but I mean this is a line that some writers have done a lot better than others since Stan Lee wrote Amazing Fantasy 15. I mean, venturing too deep into, oh, we're just going to make everything about Peter's life miserable because he's Spider-Man. And it's like, okay, because I mean, and there are some people that obviously like characters like that, but I think the majority of readers of Spider-Man appreciate when Peter gets some wins, but there's that constant tension of, okay, there has to be some level of sacrifice, but it's not like he just, gives away everything. That's one thing I look forward to as the MCU Spider-Man films go forward, because that's exactly what he did at the end of No Way Home is he gave up everything. So I guess the thing I'm looking forward to in those next films is, okay, well, how does he, how do we see he's at his lowest? So how do we see him like gradually built back up over the next film and however further along they intend to go with that? So that's kind of and I don't claim to have the exact answer, obviously, but that's kind of the tension I've always tried. I always try to check myself. I'm like, okay, are things getting too easy for him? Are things, is it just all sunshine and rainbows versus is it all, oh, where could the sun have possibly gone? Kind of depressing, like trying to avoid either extreme of those scenarios and give him some wins, but so that he's relatable in that sense, but just trying to find that tension between his responsibilities as Peter and as Spider-Man.
I think you do a really good job with balancing it because I've read some Spider-Man comics. I'm like, I don't think the writers even like Peter as a character. I think they just want to see him lose.
Yeah, because like, and I'll comment too, like that's one thing that Brian Intihar has said a lot, the creative director of the Insomniac games. Um, he's talked a lot about their philosophy is when Spider-Man wins, Peter Parker loses, and I think that that philosophy is good for like a particular story. But the thing is, if that's your philosophy across an entire series, then it just, you know, and maybe I'm just speaking for myself here, but it gets kind of irritating because it's like, okay, when are things finally going to look up for him, like out of the suit? Because like obviously we see him, handle things, as Spider-Man, but it's like if you carry that philosophy on too long, then there's a danger of, you start to lose your audience because it's like, okay, well, all they're doing is just making him miserable, which, is something that, again, we've not to harp on it too much because I've done that, Lord knows, on so many pages online, but like, it gets to be this lack of the only consistent thing is his inconsistency. He can't find a stable job, can't have a stable relationship. Like that's just not who I see him as. That's kind of almost more like a Batman thing to me, like in terms of his personal life, for instance. Like I like how the DCAU handled Batman in terms of it's like by Batman Beyond, we see, oh, the mission was just all that mattered to him because it was so ingrained in him at an early age. Peter Parker isn't like that. He was raised by not his parents necessarily, but he had a surrogate mother in May and a father and Uncle Ben, people that, he saw a loving relationship modeled in his life. And so he's a character who has always seemed to want that. So it's like, okay, you know, how much do you deny him that for the sake of tension, but avoiding where it gets just old and tiresome at the same time? So, but yeah, and I'm gonna be positive and negative towards certain properties, but at the same time, like I fully respect like, what they've done over in Insomniac with the Spider-Man games. I mean, they're some of my favorite um non-comic Spider-Man properties for sure. They really tap well into who Peter is, and honestly, they've got me into Miles just as much, maybe even more than the Spider-Verse films. So, which says a lot because I love those films too. Um, but yeah, no, I just when you're an author, you write what you want at the end of the day, and
Yeah.
so that's definitely the I almost try to fight against being too self indulgent in certain ways. Like, so I'm like, okay, there are certain things that I want. It's like, is it really in the best service of the character though? Like, so I sometimes try to check even myself against those things. But anyway,
So you said a lot. I don't really know what part to focus on because like I was so involved in all of it. I was very invested. Um,
Oh,
how do
good. I didn't
you?
lose you. That's good.
No, 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 you're good. How do you approach writing Spider-Man's voice? Is it hard to capture the unique blend of humor and responsibility that defines him?
I mean, nobody's told me that my version of his jokes have been awful, so I guess I'm doing okay in that sense. Um, no, I mean, I personally, the only part of Spider-Man, in my opinion, that's really hard to write is his scientific
Yeah.
know-how, because like I'm not even going to pretend to be a tenth of that level. I mean, and obviously, the running gag in the MCU, for instance, is that they just throw quantum in front of everything when it's just some science that they have to explain away. Like, and they do that kind of thing in the comics too. So to a point, there's you can get away with something like that, obviously. But I don't know. I like in this most recent story, I just stuck with like, Peter's focused on like a solar energy project, but I didn't go into detail because I'm like, I don't know enough about that, and I don't have time to like research all the ins and outs of what that is and what kind of hurdles he would be trying to overcome to make this kind of thing more accessible to people and more efficient and whatnot. So I'm just gonna be a little vague about that. So in terms of writing his voice, I mean, I don't think it's a big deal. I will say that this friendly neighborhood Spider-Man thing I've been writing has been more freeing, because when I would write like for the MCU Spider-Man or for the or the Andrew Garfield version of Spider-Man, like just my own versions of those continuations, it does get hard to hone in on that particular version to find that particular version's voice. Like for instance, I've written like a version of Amazing Spider-Man 3 through like a sixth story in that. And when I started on the Amazing Spider-Man 3, I felt like I had a good grasp of like Andrew Garfield's voice and I felt like things were flowing smoothly. But by Amazing Spider-Man 6, I mean, I literally had someone comment that it sounded more like the 90s cartoon version of the character. And I went back and looked at it. I'm like, yeah, that's kind of true, actually. So it's like, so in terms of doing specific versions, it can be tricky, obviously, to not let all the versions I've seen like kind of bleed into and influence one or the other. But in terms of my own version, I feel like finding the voice um, has been much easier, because it's like, oh well, this is just who I've kind of come to view, the sum total of who Peter and Spider-Man are in my head, and so I felt like I had a much more clearer picture, just kind of doing something a little more independent. But but yeah, the science know-how is tricky, and I do. There are definitely times I feel like if I'm harder on myself on something, it's in his how he interacts with the people, like Mary Jane and Aunt May and Harry and stuff like that. Like finding his dynamics with certain characters that I imagine them to be can be a bit tricky sometimes. But in terms of his overall voice, I haven't had as much a problem with that. At least, again, speaking in my own opinion about that.
No, I agree. I think you handle it really well. I especially think the jokes are very, very Peter. They just feel like it.
Yeah, because I mean, I've always imagined Peter is like has like dad joke energy, even to a
Yeah.
degree, even as a like I was also looking over well, he either is one or the other. He either has like really juvenile energy or like really dad joke energy, depending on the age you write him. I mean, I was looking at it popped up on my Facebook from one of the old Ultimate comics where Brian Michael Bendis wrote it, and it's just from the issue where he's got his mask, but he's wearing like a shirt and sweats, and some criminals are like, "Well, where's your shirt?" And he's like, "Oh, your mom's washing it for me," or something like that. Like, "Where's your outfit?" And so it's like that kind of humor. It's always been that like I've always interpreted that like if he were trying to do a stand-up routine, he may or may not receive the best reception. Like it'd be 50-50 whether they'd actually land. But it's not about that for him. It's just about him, either masking his concern in that moment, or it's about him like just enjoying the anonymity that the mask affords him. Like maybe a side of him is coming out that wouldn't normally come out just as Peter. So I definitely enjoy trying to come up with some of those. There are some that I'm a little more proud of than others. Like I can't remember one off the top of my head, but there are some where I'm like, yeah, that sounded good. And then there are others where I'm like, that could probably be a little better, but don't know what it should be. So
Yeah.
so it's hit or miss writing Spider-Man's humor in particular. That's definitely like there are so many the Insomniac and Spectacular Spider-Man cartoons definitely and games definitely there's so many ones that I can think of from those where I chuckle to myself a little bit just even thinking of some of the lines they wrote in there. So I aspire to eventually get to that kind of level, but we'll see.
Yeah. Well, I think you're doing great so far. So,
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you.
you're welcome. How do you handle the complex relationships Peter has with people like Mary Jane or Aunt May or his other loved ones?
Yeah, see, that's tough, and that's where I feel like it. To me, it almost depends on his age. Like, I feel like as I've continued in this, I feel like I've struggled more writing younger Spider-Man. Like, I just enjoy the more adult relationships with like Mary Jane and May, like as he's older and stuff. Like, maybe it's because I'm getting where I'm past that time in my life by a little more significant a margin now, being in my 30s. I still remember a little bit, but I mean, so much has changed too, even since, I was 16, 17 years old.
Yeah.
It's so I like writing him when he's at least a little closer to my own age now, but like in terms of I feel like it's different with each individual character because Peter, I mean, obviously has very different dynamics. I mean, even with the ladies in his life, I mean, his dynamic with Mary Jane is different than with Black Cat. His dynamic with Black Cat is different than it was with Gwen Stacy, and so on and so forth. Like, it all looks a little different. I'll say that um, with Mary Jane, for instance, I've always felt like, and this is probably something we'll get into a little bit more later on, but like, I feel like there's a comfortability there, especially as their relationship goes, that isn't as existent in other versions with other love interests and stuff. So it's like, but at the same time, there's that flirtation, but at the same time, it's like, okay, well, it's not quite like like Superman and Lois Lane, like it's not exactly the same. Like there's a little bit of a difference there in terms of, based on what's happened in those characters' backgrounds compared to them. So I feel like there's a danger there in terms of like just becoming like the stereotypical bantery kind of relationship. Like there needs to be something that's true to them specifically. So it's like finding that, with May, I feel like May is a character that like Peter's dynamic with her changes depending on whether she's like a worry body like the old school comics where she's like old and frail versus a lot of more recent iterations where she's like the stronger aunt, like the one who you could have seen being like the backbone of the home and like Peter, where Peter got his moral core from aside from Uncle Ben. Like people have written her so differently that the dynamic changes just depending on the foundation of what her character is. So, and then with Harry, I mean, Harry's a character that I feel like has almost kind of gotten lost in a lot of recent Spider-Man stuff. Like he's just not, he's not in the MCU right now, as far as we know. I mean, his dynamic with Peter in the Amazing Spider-Man series and in two was, very hit or miss in terms of how well received it was. So it's like Harry's a character that I've almost had to like work to like with this original series I've been doing is a character I've had to like really work to find his dynamic with Peter, and flesh out. Like I was really inspired by like the Insomniac games. I'll praise them for this. They made like my favorite version of Harry, like outside of the comics, maybe ever. Like I loved his the way they wrote them as having like somewhat similar interests, but Peter's still like the definitively smarter, more intelligent one. Harry's just kind of like the more like socially savvy
Yeah.
one. I've always enjoyed I enjoyed that so much, and so I kind of tried to incorporate that a little bit. But the big thing I feel like is in terms of his dynamic, it's like, it always comes back to, how it depends on really how understanding and how much drama you want to, in terms of that tension between his Peter Parker and Spider-Man personas. It's like how much drama do you want to incorporate into his relationships with Spider-Man? And again, I think that that's something, there's the classic, oh, where were you? You were missing from this. That's something that's good in his like high school, college, maybe even early adult years. But by the time he gets to an adult, it's like, okay, he's probably either let somebody in on his secret or someone's just found out through his own, you know, being bad at hiding his identity. Like, it gets to a point where he needs to have people that he trusts and can talk openly. That's one thing I love. One of my favorite Amazing Spider-Man runs is J. Michael Straczynski's run on the Amazing Spider-Man in the mid 2000s, since passed, and One More Day obviously excluded from that. But like,
Yeah.
obviously. But I loved his dynamic with Mary Jane and May, in that they were both in on his secret, and there was gone was the whole like, oh, you didn't do this, you didn't show up for my play because of this, which I defend Mary Jane more than most in Spider-Man 2 on that. But I mean, I do see where the annoyance is for people for sure, and I know you're harder on her,
Yeah.
so I'm not gonna sugarcoat that. I
Yeah.
obviously know that
Yeah.
you're one of the many who are hard on her, and I will say I do prefer both MCU MJ and the Amazing Spider-Man Gwen more
Mm.
as love interest for sure. But that aside, so it's like his dynamic. It just depends on how much you want to milk out that Spider-Man drama. Like I feel like that influences everything else. Like how honest is he being with everybody, and that's going to change. How much they trust him, how honest their conversations are going to be, etc. So that influences everything else to me. So that's a roundabout way of coming back to a simple answer on that question.
Oh, I mean, it's writing. I feel like if there is a simple answer, I feel like it wasn't very well thought through. You know what I mean?
Right. Well, and that's the thing. I mean, everybody, writing is one of the most, they say beauty is in the eye of the beholder. I mean, that's as much true in my experience, at least in writing, as it is in art. Like, it's, what may be a good, what I may be saying may be good for some, and others may be like, I don't think he gets it, or doesn't appeal to me. Like, it's so subjective. So it's, everyone's got, and you see that obviously with the people who've actually gotten paid to write Spider-Man. I mean, everybody's brought their own flavor to things. I mean, I was talking about May, J. Michael Straczynski's talked about. He's like, I never liked May as like that old frail woman. And he's like, this is a woman who, raised, Peter, his last few teenage years by herself. I mean, this has got to be a decently tough woman. Like, um, and that was a significant shift from a lot of what had been in the comics before. So, I mean, everybody adds their own touches and their own flavors to things.
That's true, which begs my next question. How do you stay true to Spider-Man's origins while introducing a fresh take or new ideas to your stories?
Yeah, so I mean, and again, it comes back to what I talked about earlier for one about, you write what you want to see. And, thinking of, this current series, especially where, I'm giving myself more freedom since I'm not bound to a movie or a show's continuity prior to like getting to write my own history. I think that, I mean, the main thing is remembering again, just that the responsibility is always key. And again, what is how does he embody his responsibilities as Peter Parker? I mean, because, I give uh, Dan Slott a lot of flack, but one thing I love that he did compared to most other Spider-Man writers is actually giving Peter a real job as a scientist. I
Yeah.
loved that part of his run so much that time where he was working at Horizon Labs. I wish it had lasted longer, honestly, um, but I mean, in terms of keeping true to it versus adding stuff, I mean, I think it just because I've listened to a lot of people talk about how like continuity is just, it's nonsense. Comic writers change it all the time anyway. So it's like, when it comes to the movies or shows, everybody should just be free to do whatever they want. And
Hmm.
I think that's true to a point. I mean, there definitely needs to be some freedom for in different ways, but at the same time, I mean, there's a reason these characters have lasted so long, and especially a character like Spider-Man is because of that element of consistency regarding their persona, how they behave. what they stand for. So I think, making Peter a guy who, is at his core like, a decent person, but can still be a little bit, sometimes he's a little arrogant, sometimes he's a little, he gets angry easily depending on the situation. Like I feel like just inserting those little faults amidst all the good stuff on occasion is the big thing that keeps the character interesting. I feel like as long as you aren't afraid to have the good, the bad, and the ugly about the character in there, as long as it's not something that's like just going to drive people away. Like, there has to be some common sense there to a degree, but like, just, I feel like as long as you embody what Spider Man stands for, what, you know, the relationships he has with the people around him, I feel like as long as as personally, my philosophy is as long as I do that, then the rest, it's like, okay, I can tweak a little bit about his history with so and so, or I can tweak a little bit about like what his current dynamic is with an ally, with with a supervillain, with a loved one, that's the only thing where I'm like, okay, this absolutely must remain intact is who Peter Parker and Spider Man are as characters. I can't change like I refuse to change like who they are. As long as I hold to that, then like where he was at when he got bitten by the spider, or what you know how he met MJ, or how whatever the how he got into being a scientist. Like all of those things can change, in my opinion, at least. It just as long as you stay true to who he is, who his supporting cast is, then I think the rest is pretty malleable.
Okay. Well, what is your approach to world building with Spider-Man in Spider-Man's universe? Are there specific elements of New York or Spider-Man's world that you particularly enjoy exploring?
Well, one thing I really love, and again, I'll freely admit to taking inspiration from some of the comics, but also like the Insomniac games, because one thing I love about the side quests is just the very friendly neighborhood nature of it. Like, I think in my first uh, friendly neighborhood Spider-Man story, I just had him, in like the second or third chapter, I just had him, play checkers or something with a random civilian that he had like talked off the deep end at one point and just had been kind of checking in on him ever since. And like that was Peter as Spider-Man helping the guy, keep the memory of his like I think it was his son alive because that was something that him and his son used to do. And so Peter's been kind of helping him like keep that memory up. So it's like I really enjoy exploring, like as much as I enjoy like the supervillain fights and stuff. Like I really enjoy that friendly neighborhood dynamic, and I enjoy his dynamic with other heroes as well. Like I've enjoyed writing his interactions with Daredevil in this series, his interactions with Johnny Storm, and alluding to like his history with the Fantastic Four. I mean, in my opinion, those are the two most important like superhero friendships he has is with Daredevil and the F4. Like he can have relationships obviously with the X-Men, especially someone like Wolverine and stuff like that. Like those are all vital in their own way, but if you look at his history, if you look at the characters that have been there for him the most consistently, I feel like it comes down to those people right there. And in my next story, there will definitely be some difficult choices involving those allies, possibly, but that's a topic for possibly further on. But anyway, but I like the idea again, starting off where he's like, mid 20s. It's like, this idea that he just has this history with these people and like he refers to them by name. Matt will reach out to him and be like, hey, I got some info on the Kingpin, and he'll just stop by, Matt's law office
Yeah.
and just get something. Like I like that sense that they have a history. So I enjoy, and in terms of like parts of New York, I mean, I like, in terms of, riding when he perches on like, the Chrysler building as a spot to think about, kind of like what they talk about in No Way Home in terms of like, their thinking places and stuff like that. But in terms of the city itself, it's predominantly just his relationship to the people, like just how he interacts in the middle of a save, or even just, checking on somebody, even in the midst of a supervillain fight, like, just those little touches that remind you that he's not, just about, saving the world, but he's about, looking out for the little guy. So I always appreciate those kind of dynamics with, just the everyday civilian in New York.
I like those too. I do, going back to you talking about your writing with involves Daredevil, Matt Murdock. Those are some of my favorite stories you write because I feel like you have nailed the dynamic that I think it should be between Spider-Man and Daredevil. There's such a good, seeable respectability about both of them that it works really, really well the way you write it.
Yeah, like one of my favorite bits where I've ever written them is where they're basically talking about their like morally ambiguous former love interests in Black Cat and Elektra, like kind of where he's walking along and they're discussing that, and Matt's kind of alluding to like that there might be something there again, and Peter's like trying to kind of poke at him for it, and and he's like, oh no, I'm not going to deal with that. He's like, hey, I get it, and like so I definitely enjoy. I mean, they're my favorite dynamic. Like as much as I love like Batman and Superman, like Spider-Man and Daredevil are absolutely like my number one favorite superhero team up. Like I love those two together because on paper they're so different, but at the same time they find little things um to relate to each other. Like Matt has a little bit, like they both have a strong moral center, but Matt has a little bit more of an occasionally pragmatic view, whereas Peter has like the eternal optimist, like the nobody
Yeah.
dies standpoint. And Matt would obviously never root for anybody to die either, but at the same time, like there's, Matt believes in the law, whereas Peter's like, okay, the law only gets us so far. What about this? And so I like that dynamic that they have. So yeah, I appreciate you saying that. That's really reassuring actually, because they're one of the in terms of his relationships to his allies. I mean, that's one of the things I want to get the most right. So
Well, I think you're doing great, but we have talked so much about the heroes in Spider-Man's life. Let's talk about the villains. Which of Spider-Man's rogues gallery do you find the most interesting, and how do you approach writing those villains in your stories?
I mean, for a long time, I would have said it was the Eddie Brock version of Venom that was my favorite. Now I would level it out to say he's even with the Green Goblin. Um, and really, when I think of the big three, so Norman Green Goblin, Venom, and then Doc Ock, like I love that his top three all challenge him in different ways. Like they obviously all challenge him physically, but like the Green Goblin challenges him on one of the most personal of levels, just because that relationship with Harry and uh, you know Harry kind of being caught in the middle in a sense, and he's the one who's kind of most out to mess with Peter, and is also the one Peter perhaps has to think on his feet on the most. Um, but I also love Venom because it's like, okay, Peter literally wore
Yeah.
Venom at one point, which I could get into a side note about Venom, but I'm not going to. But it's like no, it's like just Venom is a fusion of Eddie and the symbiote. It just bothers me when the symbiote is named Venom from the beginning. I'm like, no, that's literally he named himself. They named themselves Venom just because that was what Eddie, as he alludes to in the comics, is what he's paid to spew out after he got fired from the paper he was working at and was working for tabloids. But anyway, I could go on a million of those kinds of tangents, but I'm going to try to restrain myself. I warned you this was going to happen, but
It's all right. I'm here for it. I don't care.
but anyway, but yeah, Venom. There's a huge psychological element as much as a physical, because I mean he's obviously more powerful than Spider-Man in just about every way, but he knows him better than literally any other villain. Like because of his Peter's previous relationships with the symbiote, like there's no secret that he can hide from Venom in terms of what he would do. So I always appreciate that. And then Doc Ock, I mean, is the one character who I think is technically supposed to be the one character who's canonically smarter in terms of Peter's rogues gallery, is supposed to be canonically more intelligent than he is. So he challenges Peter in an intellectual sense as much as a physical, which I've always appreciated. But yeah, in terms of writing the villains, because there are some villains, like for instance, in the two Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man stories I've written, like I love like getting into like lower tier guys like the Prowler. Like as much as the Spider-Verse films have popularized the Aaron Davis Prowler Miles Prowler relationship. I enjoy coming back to like the older original Prowler and Hobie Brown, um, from like that I first watched in the '90s series. Um, I definitely really enjoyed doing that because he's a more like every man, kind of like Peter is. He's a little bit more sympathetic. Whereas then you come to the Green Goblin, and it's like the Green Goblin is like the ultimate evil. Like, Norman Osborn may be sympathetic, but the Green Goblin persona is like everything. He's the Joker to Spider-Man's Batman. I mean, he's,
Yeah.
the character that has done the worst stuff to him in the comics, that, he's the one that's always pushed him in a way like that, that Kingpin pushes Daredevil, and that, like as a Joker, that Lex Luthor pushes Superman. Like he's that guy. And so I always enjoy writing him because he's the guy that I can be like, okay, there's like no restraints there. Like nothing's off the table with the Green Goblin. Like he would do anything to hurt Spider-Man. And he wouldn't just like do it like, oh, I'm just gonna blow you up and be done with it. He's like, no, I'm gonna make you suffer like to where you like almost wish you were dead in the first place, and then I'm gonna do it.
It's petty.
And
It feels petty from him.
exactly.
Hmm.
Well, that's the thing. Like you look at the Goblin's history with Spider-Man. It's like he started off just wanting to take over the criminal underworld, and then Peter just kept intervening as Spider-Man, and eventually that was started off as more of a nuisance relationship became so personal. So I like that the idea. He's like, I'm just sick of this guy. I'm going to do everything I can to ruin him. And Peter's obviously, I like the tension too, where Peter's obviously fighting for Norman for the sake of Harry, if nothing else. Even if he does, whether he likes or doesn't like Norman, he knows that he's like, I can't let Harry lose his father. So that tension there is palpable in terms of how do you handle, because like with the Joker, there's no like secondary personality. That's one thing that separates him from the Green Goblin. Like the Green Goblin has a separate persona that Peter's like, oh, I got to keep this in mind. Like I can't just, even if my moral code failed, I couldn't kill this guy because I would be hurting, one of my closest friends. So, but I enjoy a lot of Spider-Man's villains. I mean, I love a basic brute like the Rhino. Like I love a more sadistic character like the Scorpion. I love their dynamic in the Insomniac games, like where they're just like two characters who just absolutely should never be partnered together for anything ever. Um, but I enjoy like mixing and matching like some sympathetic characters, some like that are just evil and desert, because like you can't just stick to one formula in terms of like all sympathetic or all just like it's all black and white, it's all good and bad. Like I appreciate a mix, a variety there. So I think that different characters lend themselves more. Like obviously, a lot of people have, taken, in Spider-Man 2 and the Insomniac games have put a more sympathetic spin on Doc Ock, where it was like more a tragedy that he ended up the way he did. Um, so it's like, being able to take those kind of spins on those types of characters. Like I enjoyed, like mentioned, exploring with Hobie, like the idea that he was kind of finally trying to get out from under like the underworld's thumb, but just needed a little help to be able to get out of that. Like, to really put off bad habits for good. Like I enjoyed that Peter would try to help a guy like that. So finding a mix there is different. But I mean, yeah, Green Goblin, Venom are my favorites. But I mean, the Lizard is another one. I haven't really written much of the Lizard. Yeah, that's something I look forward to hopefully tackling one day down the line. But I always appreciate the dynamic with the Lizard in terms of kind of similar to the Green Goblin, but in terms of like it's just an animal like that he has to subdue in order to get to Connors. It's not even someone necessarily who may or may not have like a conscious mind, depending on the iteration. Like but I mean, Spider-Man has the greatest rogues gallery. Batman's the only other one that I would argue is like they're basically in the same tier. Like, Superman has a decent gallery, but I mean, I think there is a reason that people keep coming back to like Lex Luthor and Zod and Doomsday. I mean, those are the ones that challenge Superman in the ways he needs to be challenged the most. Whereas I feel like with Spider-Man, so many of his rogues challenge him in so many different ways, and so it's so fun to dive into all of those.
Is there a certain villain that you'd want to see in Spider-Man 4 against Tom Holland's Spider-Man?
Oh my goodness. I mean, and I'm definitely on the side. Obviously, whether or not that's going to happen, we'll see. But I'm definitely more on the side of I want, the more street level approach based on
Yeah.
this stage he's at now. Honestly, while I would be cool, like having Daredevil in it and beginning that relationship would be awesome. Part of me honestly just wants him to like just him versus a villain and no MCU guest stars, like no heavy hitters. As long as it's a Sony MCU fusion, obviously that's probably never going to happen for
Yeah.
contractual reasons if nothing else. But like I don't know, in terms of this particular villain. That's a tough one. I mean, part of me would like to see them play on the whole plays into the creation of the Scorpion angle. I feel like since they introduced him in No Way Home, I feel like there's a chance to do a deeper dive on Jameson's character than the films have really explored in the past, where he's been more like kind of comic relief.
Yeah.
Um, some elements of depth, but like I think that would be a real fun story. It'd be, finally a payoff to the end of Homecoming where the guy, because you don't necessarily need anything to do with, whether he ever knew his identity or whatnot, because that grudge is still there from Homecoming since even before Peter's identity got released to the world. So that would be a fun tale to me, and that could be too like where like Jameson like maybe even inadvertently kind of finds himself in the throes of the underworld as well, and that could be the lead to like a larger like Fisk story. Like I definitely love where they seem to be aiming with the idea that Fisk might become mayor, and then in turn he'll make it life harder for Spider-Man and Daredevil and the street level heroes, and kind of like I don't know. I like that approach. So I will say if he does fight Fisk in the MCU, like I definitely look forward to that day where Spider-Man confronts Vincent D'Onofrio's Fisk. I mean, that's a top tier comic villain brought to life if I ever saw one. But I mean, it's always bugged me when they've made Fisk be able to just trade punches with Spider-Man. So I want it to be more about what Fisk is doing behind the scenes in
That
terms of that. So especially because we've already seen Daredevil. I mean, if a guy with Daredevil who definitely has enhanced senses and everything, but normal like strength. So it's like if you have a guy that Daredevil can beat up, suddenly be like, oh, I can actually beat up Spider-Man. Then it kind of removes some of that like that tension to a degree. And it's like, well, how can Daredevil beat this guy? But anyway, comics do that all the time, so that's part of
true.
it. But
See, I agree. I think it should be Kingpin with a secondary villain as Scorpion working for Kingpin, and it gets shown at the end. And then at the end, you have a post-credit scene where Daredevil comes in and says, "I think we're after the same guy." That's what I want.
yeah, I love the idea of a very like Nick Fury, Tony Stark esque kind of meeting. Like, as Peter obviously knows like all the big kids on the block, if you will, but like he doesn't really have a relationship with any of the street level guys because the MCU trilogy to this point is focused on like the bigger stuff, his relationship to the Avengers and whatnot. So getting to shift gears and explore more the everyday dynamic. I mean, it's a perfect setup for that with, his identity being lost, he's on his own now. It's the perfect time to introduce that. So, but we'll see what if Sony and Marvel agree, obviously.
If they ever do, who knows?
Yeah, I don't even want part of me wants to be a fly on the wall during those meetings where they're like pitching ideas back and forth. Part of me feels like I would hate it and um not end up wanting to leave. But yeah, I don't know. That'd be interesting.
I do think something's going to happen with that soon enough because there's nothing really planned for after Craven, and they
Yeah.
canceled El Morte. So it's like, what do they have planned if they're
Yeah.
allowed to?
I still say it was a huge missed opportunity. Like you could keep Tom Holland a cinematic Spider-Man, but capitalizing on Andrew Garfield's popularity. I mean, if they did like a big budget streaming series like one of the Disney Plus shows, I feel like a mini series just kind of continuing his story. So he's like kind of like the television Spider-Man
Yeah.
to Tom Holland's theatrical. I mean, I feel like that would be huge. Plus, they're at two very different versions of their lives, so they appeal to like Spider-Man fans, but also people of different, age groups and stuff. So, um, but anyway, I'm not the one getting paid the big bucks to make these choices. So what's my opinion count for? But
I feel like our opinion should count for a lot as fans who want best for the character and not
and I
looking at it.
agree.
Yeah, we're not looking at it from a money perspective. We're looking at it for the good of the character.
Yeah, and that's tough because I don't. Is I try to take a step back every time I tend to get riled up internally, where it's like, okay, I'm not going to pretend to know what it's like to sit in, Avi Arad shoes, Kevin Feige's shoes, the people that, as much as they want to lean towards only the best creative choices, it's like, okay, they unfortunately have to keep in mind the money side of things. Like, I try to remember that it's like, okay, they're not just out to, if they make a choice that I don't like, they're not just out to ruin the character. Or like, I have pretty harsh opinions about, the Sony verse, kind of the non Spider-Man films, but it's like at the same time, I don't pretend to know what it's like when you got to answer to, the multi-million dollar money making machine. I mean, so I always try to take a step back and cut those people a little bit of slack as much as I want to stay tough on them because it's like, I can't ever put myself in their shoes because I don't know.
Yeah.
So I try my best to do that. It's hard sometimes, but I definitely try to do my best with that.
Well, I think that's very fair. We'll never know until we're in that position, and we'll probably never be in that position because I don't think anyone wants to right now.
Yeah, yeah, I wouldn't want to answer to the mouse or to Sony or
Mm-mm.
to anybody like, that would be a big. I can't even imagine the things where they'd tell me to do such and such. I'm like, I'd want to be like, no, like that's a terrible idea. But you know, I mean, that's what got J. Michael Straczynski stuck with One More Day. I mean, that's you got to do what they say. Unfortunately, when you're on contract, and I can't even imagine if I got stuck with that. And like, no, here's the money you would have paid me for these last little bit, but
Yeah.
you gotta you gotta support your family as well. So it's like, so yeah,
Ye-
I definitely get it.
That's just a thoughts and prayers kind of situation.
Yes,
Um,
very much so.
so
That's
my
one thing.
last, oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Just as a side tangent, that's one thing that I respect John Semper Jr. for, because in the wake of the calls, in the wake of the success of X-Men '97 and everyone calling for a Spider-Man '98 thing, like his response has been like, "Look, I need to have the freedom that I had for the most part in when I was making the original series to continue," and I respect him for that. That he's I have to believe there have been conversations at some point, but like I respect that he's like, look, unless I have the same level of freedom that I did then in terms of just what I can do with the series, you know, I won't do it. And I respect that he's willing to kind of stand on what he believes is best for that version of the character that he helped shape. So I don't know. That was just a fun little thing.
Yeah, I agree. But so we're coming to the end of what's been a very fun conversation. I could talk about Spider-Man all day long. So where can our listeners find you and your all your writing, everything?
So yeah, I'm on Archive of Our Own and fanfiction.net as SpideyFan62. And if I remember correctly, I just got on Wattpad as well, finally. So I changed my name on there to, I think it's SpideyFan 2024, I think was what I did there. So that's where you can find me on that. And obviously you can find me posting on the Nerd Haven page. I post my chapters pretty frequently. And I'm really excited because I have plans for continuing the Spider-Man series, but I also have plans for like writing my own book that I just intend to publish of my own. That's something completely different from anything I've ever done before. So I'm really excited. Hopefully I can come back and share more details with that
Yeah,
as things come along.
I would love that. That sounds so amazing. Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, I look forward to it for sure.
Yeah. So, oh gosh, I lost my page. Okay. That does it for another episode of the new and improved Vigilante Vibes. TJ, thank you so much for coming on. Please feel free to come back anytime. You're
Absolutely.
you were amazing.
No, thank you so much, Megan. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate all you do as well.
No, thank you. Wherever you're listening or watching this episode, please check the show notes to find the links where you can find TJ. It is right under this episode. Thanks for listening to this episode of Vigilante Vibes. Hope you all enjoyed it. Be sure to keep up with all new episodes by clicking the subscribe button wherever you're listening or watching this episode. As always, thank you for your constant support and have a marvelous day.